I'm here today because I'm concerned. I'm concerned that our child welfare system isn't carefully calibrated to minimize the likelihood that children unnecessarily pass through our foster care system. And whenever I think about the injustice of unnecessarily separating children from their parents, two high-profile cases come to mind. The first involves an incident where a University of Michigan professor brought his son to a Detroit Tigers baseball game. And while he was at that baseball game, he got his kid some lemonade. Well, it turns out that was Mike's Hard Lemonade. And the second his son took a sip of it, his son knew something was wrong. But a security guard saw that child take a sip of Mike's Hard Lemonade and reported it to authorities. And what ensued over the next few hours was this young child by the name of Leo being removed and placed in foster care. He was removed and placed in foster care despite his father insisting it was a simple, honest mistake. He was removed and placed in foster care despite his mother, who was not at the baseball game, pleading to be able to take her son home. He was removed and placed in foster care despite doctors that night finding no trace of alcohol in his system. He was removed and placed in foster care despite his aunt driving overnight, his aunt who was a licensed social worker and a certified foster parent in another state, to come take custody of him. But instead of spending that night with his family, he slept on a couch in a CPS office. Now, with the resources of his father's employer, the University of Michigan, and the ACLU, Leo was able to go home a couple of days later and eventually have the case dismissed. Now, in that same month, just over a decade ago, there was a case that was a little less sympathetic in the media, but implicated these same sorts of issues. And that was when a call went into the Texas hotline that there was a community where there was system-wide abuse, including allegations of sexual abuse. And based on that allegation, Texas authorities went in to the community known as the Yearning for Zion Ranch and removed over 460 children from the care and custody of their parents. And what followed that case was a series of legal challenges, ultimately resulting in the Texas Supreme Court declaring the removal of those children unjust and ordering them to be returned to their parents at the Yearning for Zion Ranch. Now, these two cases sensationalize the unjust separation of children from their parents. But these aren't the cases that cause me concern. The cases that cause me concern are the mundane, day-to-day removals that happen every day in our nation's child welfare system. Each year we remove over 250,000 children from the care and custody of their parents, and I am certain that some subset of those removals represent the same injustices that are demonstrated in the Mike's Hard Lemonade case and are demonstrated in the Yearning for Zion case. I'm concerned about this issue for three reasons. The first reason I'm concerned is that the law is built on the premise that removal is child welfare's intervention of last resort. We require an agency to demonstrate that it is contrary to the welfare of the child to remain in the home before we allow them to be removed. That's a high bar. You can contrast that with the standard of best interest. We're not asking whether it would be best for the child to be removed from their home. We're asking if it would be unsafe not to remove them. But not even that is enough. We also require that the state agency demonstrate that they tried to find alternatives to removal. Our nation's principles are rooted in family integrity, and we require agencies to remove children only when there's an imminent threat of harm that we cannot avoid. The second reason that I'm concerned about unnecessary separations of children from their families is because there's an expansive body of research that demonstrates the harm children suffer the moment they are separated from their parents. I first learned about this issue when I read some of Dr. Monique Mitchell's research. And I was very persuaded by the way she described the ambiguities and losses that children suffered moment by moment as they were being removed from their children and transitioned into our foster care system. But Dr. Mitchell's research is not alone. She has many colleagues in the field that have studied this phenomenon. And the fact that removal harms children is so unambiguous that Dr. Charles Nelson, a pediatrician from Harvard Medical School, reflected earlier in a comment to the Washington Post that if we knew anything about the science, we would never do this. But we do this, day in and day out in the name of child protection. And that's the third reason that I'm concerned with the involuntary separation of children from their families. Each year, we remove more than 250,000 children for the purpose of placing them in foster care. And I'm concerned not as much with how much that represents, but more about where that happens, when that happens, and why that happens. So I want you to first consider West Virginia, the state that boasts the highest removal rate per capita. A child living in West Virginia during the most recent year for which we have data was 10 times as likely to enter foster care as a child living here in Virginia, which boasts the nation's lowest removal rate. Now, I do not know what the correct number of children that should be in foster care at any given time, but what I do know is that our foster care system shouldn't produce a system in which the likelihood that you enter foster care differs by a factor of 10 across neighboring states. The second reason that I'm concerned from a data standpoint about the unnecessary separation of children from their families is that among those 250,000 some odd children that enter our foster care system each year, just over 20,000 of them, like Leo in the University of Michigan Mike's Hard Lemonade case, spend very little time in foster care. They spend typically a couple of weeks in foster care. And like Leo in the University of Michigan case, they spend that time in care with unfamiliar caretakers in an unfamiliar environment, likely compounding their grief and trauma and loss. And after a couple of weeks in that unfamiliar placement or that unfamiliar environment, we simply discharge most of those children back to their family. And this begs the question for me, isn't it likely that some of those 20-some thousand children never needed to be removed to foster care in the first place? I struggle to think about what imminent threat that is so impervious to remediation through reasonable efforts can somehow be cured just a couple of weeks later to where we can send that child back to their family. I've talked to a lot of folks across the nation as I've studied these data and tried to understand why this may be happening. And what I often hear is that these removals are happening in the context of an emergency. And I'm asked to imagine a late night phone call from law enforcement where something traumatic and a crisis is happening. I'm asked to imagine a phone call from a doctor where time is short and we have to act quickly. But 237 aggregate years worth of data across 18 states challenge that narrative. Those data reveal that most removals, 93% of all removals, happen during the business week, Monday to Friday. And there may be some good reasons. We could probably brainstorm through some reasons why that may happen. Maybe it's because they're less exposed to mandated reporters on the weekend. Maybe it's because agencies are less staffed on a weekend. But none of those criteria are characteristics about child safety. They are characteristics about the system we have designed to protect children. And what I know is that it is certainly not because they are somehow more safe on weekends when they are spending more time with the same family members we are so concerned about protecting them from. And I also think about the fact that 2/3 of the removals in our nation implicate neglect as a reason for removal. That's the most common removal reason in our nation. And whatever sort of proxy or context that neglect is substituting for, in my mind, I do not imagine it being a sudden onset of a serious condition requiring immediate action. No, in my mind, it's more of a long-standing, chronic environmental stressor for a family. So we have to dispel the notion that these are emergencies that we cannot do anything about. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was drawn to think about the 100-year anniversary of the Children's Bureau that occurred a few years ago. It was in 1912 where President Taft signed into legislation the establishment of the Children's Bureau, and he appointed Julia Lathrop to be the first director of the Children's Bureau. She was running a federal agency as a presidential appointee before she had a right to vote. And in establishing those priorities for the Children's Bureau, she leaned heavily on promoting, from a data-driven standpoint, children's and families' health. She wanted to work on things like documenting the rate of infant mortality and identifying strategies to reduce it. But she also framed her priorities through a lens of social justice. And in one of her earliest speeches on behalf of the Bureau, she stood up and said, "The Children's Bureau expresses our nation's sense of justice. And the justice of today is born out of yesterday's pity." I am filled with curiosity about what Julia Lathrop would think about the state of child welfare today. What does a just child welfare system look like? Does it look like a child welfare system where the likelihood that you enter foster care varies by a factor of 10 across state lines? Does it look like a foster care system where nearly 1 out of every 10 removals results in a child being returned to their own family after living in an unfamiliar environment for just a couple of weeks? I don't think so. So what does a just child welfare system look like? It looks like objective and validated assessments of child safety at the outset of a case. It looks like state agencies having a strong anti-poverty agenda that goes head-to-head with the injustice and generational economic insecurity that families are often born into. It looks like courts and lawyers carefully scrutinizing removal decisions before they ever happen, before that removal is effectuated on a family. And I could go on, but I'd sort of be missing the point. Because I think what a just child welfare system requires is something far more intrinsic. What a just child welfare system requires is for the professionals and anyone who touches the child welfare system to believe what was so core to the first director of the Children's Bureau. We have to believe that the children and families that we interact with are deserving of justice. And so one day, when I pull up my computer and I start looking at the most recently released data, I hope that they suggest that we're inching towards that goal. Thank you very much.